Hello guys, and welcome back to our training seminar. Today is our 7th topic, and we're going to be talking about cardiovascular training. And our tagline for today is cardiovascular training, the right amount and the right types. And so let's get into talking about cardiovascular training, because like with everything else, there's a lot of myths about cardiovascular training, when it should be used, what it's used for, and a few other things. Cardiovascular training, essentially what it is in a nutshell, it is doing any sort of activity to get your cardiovascular system or to get your heart rate to increase. And it can be done in a numerous different ways. It's simply to get your heart rate to elevate, to get your heart rate to increase, and all these positive things start happening that improve your health, improve the conditioning of your heart, improve your cardiovascular system, hence being called cardiovascular training. And the most important thing about cardiovascular training that you have to know is it can be done anywhere. Cardiovascular training essentially is not only is it elevating heart rate, but it's simply is tagged directly towards activity. And so you don't have to go into a gym. You don't have to ride a bike. You don't have to do buy a piece of equipment in order to be more cardiovascularly fit. Being involved in sports, activities, playing with your kids, playing with your grandkids, just going outside and doing stuff. It's all cardiovascularly oriented things that can improve. So let's look at, okay, now that we kind of know what cardiovascular activity is, simply let's look at some of, and kind of knowing what cardiovascular activity is, simply activity and traditional going into the gym and doing stuff. Let's look at the benefits, what it helps you to do, and what it also helps decreases. So let's look at what cardiovascular does as far as increasing. And one of the things that it helps to increase is what we consider your VO2 max. And we'll have a separate video on exactly what a VO2 max is. If you're wanting to know what it is right now, simply Google it. But it helps to increase your VO2 max. It helps to increase your stroke output, how much blood can actually be pumped through your system. It helps your cardiac output. It helps what we call oxidative capacity to your muscles. So the more blood can be pumped, the more oxygen that can be pumped into the muscle, the greater that it can perform. So cardiovascular training can help improve that. It can increase your sense of well-being. It's been shown to improve insulin sensitivity, and it's helped to increase glucose tolerance. So, from a dieting standpoint, from the ability to handle insulin and glucose and all that, doing cardiovascular activity definitely does help that. The things that it decreases, it can decrease your resting heart rate. So that's obviously a good thing. The less your heart beats at rest, the less stress that your heart's actually under, because you're at rest more than you are at actual work. So that it can definitely help with that. It helps to decrease exercising heart rate. So one of the things that you notice when people are in really bad shape is it doesn't take much to get their heart rate elevated, and those that are in better shape, typically it's harder for them to get their heart to pump more and to get their heart rate to increase. Therefore, they have to work harder, perform more in order to get their heart rate to speed up. So it can decrease exercising heart rate. It decreases fatigue. It decreases anxiety and depression. And in a lot of the things, like with many different types of disease, hypertension or high blood pressure, joint stiffness, things like that, joint mobility, it can all decrease a lot of that. And so when we look at, so we know that, okay, cardio is good, it increases this, it decreases that, but so we understand why we should do it, but how do we do it? That's the biggest misnomers out there, is how you actually should do it. And there's an acronym that we want to look at called FITTE, F-I-T-T-E, and that stands for frequency, intensity, time, type, and enjoyment. So when we're looking at what type of cardio, we want to set goals, have a vision for each one of those things. So how often are we going to do cardio? What's the intensity at which we're going to do cardio? What's the time? How much time are we going to do cardio in? What type of cardio are we going to do? You know, inside, outside, running, playing with kids, athletic stuff. And what's our enjoyment level going to be for that? And they each have their own, I mean, it all talks about going back to the right amount, the right type. Each of these things has its own purpose. So if we first need to identify what's our purpose for doing cardio, and then looking at this, it will help us to map out, like if we want to accomplish X, then our frequency needs to be this. If we want to, you know, like I said, accomplish this, our intensity levels need to be this. Our time, the type, and the enjoyment, they all need to match what we're trying to accomplish. You just don't get out and walk. You just don't get on the treadmill and do it aimlessly. We want to have a vision and then know what is the strategy that's going to meet that vision, and then that's where the fit comes into place, FITTE, where we match all those parameters to meet what the vision is, so the correct strategy is there for you. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment, and you know what some of the different strategies you can take. And I want to talk about you know, something called the initials RER, which stands for respiratory exchange ratio. And essentially what we want to look at is your body will burn calories differently based on the intensity at which the exercise is. So for instance, the lighter the intensity is, the greater percentage of stored fat your body will use versus stored carbohydrates. Now that's a catch-22 because the lighter the intensity, the less calories your body will burn. So even you'll initially think, well, maybe I should go into using, you know, just light intensity cardio all the time because I'm going to burn more stored fat than you know, stored carbohydrates. But that's not necessarily the true either, because then you're going to be burning less overall calories and have less of a calorie balance than you would be is if you go at a very high intensity. The maximum intensity is you're going to be burning a greater percentage of stored carbohydrates than stored fat. At the lighter intensity, you're burning 100% stored fat, 0 stored carbs. At the highest intensity, you're burning 100% stored carbs, 0% stored fat. And in between, as you go in between those two, the ratios obviously change. So you're like, okay, which one of those two do I pick? And my answer is you pick both, and it all depends. It all depends on where you're at. So that goes back into our timeline, the right amount, the right times. It all is dependent on your vision. It's dependent on where you are right now. It's dependent on where you're wanting to go. And in the beginning, because people aren't conditioned that well, because their cardiovascular system, because their heart isn't conditioned yet at that point, it's always better to start off moderately. And then as they get into, you know, more advancements and can handle exercise, then they can change their cardiovascular activities. But we want to look at something called the law of thermodynamics. And the law of thermodynamics states that, and I'm reading this off my notes, that body fat reduction can only occur when there are more calories that are being burnt than consumed. And it's a pretty easy statement, but that is the law of thermodynamics. And so we have to then, it all goes back to us logging our food, knowing how many calories we take in, and then knowing how many calories we output, because that's the only way we're going to burn stored body fat, is if we are taking in less calories than we're actually burning. And so we'll come back to the RER and respiratory exchange ratio. Another concept that I want to look at is what we call EPOC, excessive post-oxidative consumption. And all that means is that you can have we all want a fast metabolism. We all want to burn a greater percentage of calories and have a higher metabolism. Your body, after intense exercise, will burn a greater percentage of calories after exercise, after you're already done. So one of the negative drawbacks on doing light intensity cardio is that once you're done, your body goes back to normal towards its more rested state fairly quickly, where during intense bouts of exercise, your metabolic rate after exercise will stay elevated, and you'll burn a greater percentage of calories post working out. So that is called EPOC, and that's something that we also have to look at and take advantage of. Before I get into my final rant about how you do cardio and when you do cardio, let's look at a couple different things, a couple different types of cardio, because cardio is more than just getting on a treadmill or walking and going. You can use your weight training and turn it into cardio. Those that are, the ever popular circuit training or CrossFit training, where you're going nonstop, your heart rate obviously is going to increase. So that is a form of cardiovascular, exercise, because if you're doing heavy weight training, you know that your body needs a rest, that you can't continue heavy weight training, and that you need a lot of rest in between sets. Well, circuit training, you don't take rest in between sets. You keep going, and your heart rate gets elevated, probably not to the point of extreme anaerobic exercise, but your heart rate's going to get elevated. So circuit training can kill two birds with one stone. It can improve, strength capacity and get your body stronger, but it can also increase calories burnt. We also want to look at interval training. And interval training is basically doing a very high intensity followed by a low intensity. And one of the quick things I'll say is most people get interval training wrong because the intervals are too long. The goal for interval training is to get your heart rate elevated as quickly as possible, and you do that by outputting a high intensity for a short amount of time, resting, and going through intervals so you can get your heart rate to elevate to a certain level much further than just walking or much further than just running. But the problem most people will run into is their intervals are too long, where they'll do like a minute really hard and then a minute really slow, and they'll get their heart rate up to a certain level, but it won't get to its maximum. It won't reach its certain threshold because they need to push it to a different level. So one of the ways I found best to do interval training is to make your intervals shorter, to do about 15 to 20 seconds, to do 1 minute intervals, to do 15 to 20 seconds of the highest output possible, followed by 40 to 45 seconds of resting or very low output. And that will get because you're doing 15 to 20 seconds every minute, it puts your threshold much, much higher. And the final thing that we're going to cover before I get into my 1 minute rant is postural considerations and making sure that you're constantly focused on your posture, your form, making sure that your foot, your feet, your knees, your hips, that they're all in alignment. And so definitely focus on your postural considerations. Now, as far as what to do, the only thing I don't recommend is staying in between. As we have mentioned, when you're first starting off, you should be doing moderate activity. But whenever people get involved in it has to match their vision, so that's where we can help you. We can help you or other fitness professionals map out your cardiovascular just like you would anything else. But you should use both, and it should also match your vision and what you're trying to do. Light intensity, if light intensity burns a greater percentage of stored fat, less carbohydrates, and keeps your stored carbohydrates in your system, you should do that. If high-intensity cardio burns more stored carbohydrates and a higher percentage of calories, you should do that also. You should do both. You just shouldn't do what's in the middle, because most people do what's in the middle. I recommend light intensity and high intensity, not in the middle, because you get the best of both worlds by doing some light intensity, doing some high intensity, and then having a coach showing you what's best for your goal, your vision, and how to incorporate all this into what's best for you. I hope that gives you a basic rationale for cardiovascular training, what it is, what the benefits are, and some background on it. And I appreciate you joining us today and look forward to our next part in our training seminar.
When you feel that something's wrong, I'll shelter you and keep you warm. I'll never let you walk